After her fiancé dumped her for a richer heiress, she married the prince, unaware he ruled an empire. She didn't see the end coming until it was already over. Sophie Grant had spent 3 years building something. Not a marriage proposal. She'd let James Crane convince her that came later, after she'd proven herself indispensable. Not a career. She'd watched James sign her name off treaties and agreements, letting the court assume he was the brilliant strategist behind every diplomatic victory. What she'd built was a life in the shadows, invisible, safe, exactly where she'd been trained to belong. The Grand Imperial Ball was supposed to change that. Tonight, James would introduce her to the court's inner circle, not as his advisor, not as the woman who'd spent 3 years doing his work, but as his fiancé, finally visible, finally valuable. She walked through the palace corridors in her emerald gown, her heart light with anticipation. She'd even skipped the pre-ball gathering with James, planning to surprise him in his private study first. Just the two of them, a moment of quiet before the chaos of the ballroom. The study door was slightly ajar. Voices drifted through, James's voice, and another she didn't recognize. An older man, a woman laughing. Sophie paused, one hand on the door frame. She should announce herself. She should knock. She should do 100 proper things. Instead, she listened. "The terms are more than generous," James was saying. He sounded nervous. "50 million will rebuild the family holdings completely." "More than generous," the older man agreed. "In exchange, you understand, you marry Heiress. Not in 6 months. Not after some courtship period. Immediately. The engagement announcement goes out tonight." Sophie's breath caught. "Tonight? And the other arrangement?" the woman asked. Sophie recognized the voice now, Iris Bellamy, cold, amused, like someone who'd just won a game where she was the only player who knew the rules. A sound. Sophie realized it was James shuffling papers, the sound of something being slid across a desk, the sound of a life being rewritten. "Already dissolved," James said quietly. "Completely?" Iris's voice had an edge now, sharp as broken glass. "I don't want her hanging around, trying to maintain some attachment to you. It would be unseemly." "She'll be taken care of," James replied. "Financial settlement, a small stipend, enough to disappear gracefully." Sophie's hands went numb. She should have left then. She should have walked away, preserved what little dignity remained. But she couldn't move. She was frozen, listening to the architect of her erasure discuss the terms of her removal like she was a business decision, a liability to be managed. A pen appeared in James's hand. She could see it through the gap in the door. Expensive, heavy, the kind of pen that signed contracts worth millions. She watched him sign. Each letter of his name felt like a countdown, like watching a bomb tick towards 0. When the pen lifted from the paper, Sophie realized she'd stopped breathing. The door swung open suddenly, and Sophie stumbled backward. Strong hands caught her arms, steadying her before she fell. For a moment, she couldn't process what was happening. Her brain was moving too slowly, still stuck on the image of James's signature, this still echoing with Iris's cold laughter. "Careful," a voice said, low, unfamiliar, careful. Sophie looked up. The man before her wasn't someone she recognized from court. He was younger than she'd expected, but he had the bearing of someone far older, someone who'd seen things and survived them. Military uniform, she registered, black with gold threading, medals on his chest that meant something, though she couldn't interpret what. His eyes were dark, and they were looking at her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly, acutely visible. "You heard," he said. Not a question. Sophie tried to find words. There was a strange roaring in her ears, like the world was receding, like she was falling even though she was still standing. She started, then stopped. What was there to say? Yes. And I heard my fiancé just erase the last 3 years of my life? Yes. I heard my replacement laugh while I stood in the hallway like a ghost? I know what it's like, the man said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he actually did. To watch someone choose money over everything else. To understand in the span of a heartbeat that you were never actually valued at all. Sophie stared at him. Who are you? Someone who's been watching, he replied. He released her arms, and she realized she was steady enough to stand on her own. Someone who knows what James Crane has done, what his family has been doing for years. He stepped back, and Sophie could see him fully now. There was something almost dangerous about him, not in a threatening way, but in the way of a person with nothing left to lose. Not like he'd already survived the worst thing that could happen and was still standing. I also know, he continued, that what happened in this room isn't about a broken engagement. It's about a woman whose work has been systematically stolen, whose intelligence has been systematically erased, whose future was being systematically dismantled. Sophie's chest tightened. The Cranes aren't just marrying the Bellamys for money, he said quietly. They're merging with a family that's built their fortune on trafficking, extortion, and blood money. And your fiancé. He glanced toward the study, where James was probably still packing away the papers, probably relieved that the difficult part was over. He's been signing treaties on their behalf that will affect thousands of lives. Treaties he didn't write, didn't understand. He didn't deserve credit for. How do you know all this? Sophie whispered. Because I've spent the last 5 years documenting it, he replied, building a case, waiting for the right moment to expose it. He extended his hand. My name is Maxim Valentino, he said, and I have an offer for you. Sophie looked at his hand. This stranger who'd appeared at the moment her world collapsed. This man who somehow knew exactly what she'd just witnessed. This person who was offering her something when everything had just been taken away. She thought about James, still in that study, about Heiress, already celebrating, about a life spent invisible and underestimated and dismissed. She thought about how good it felt to be seen, even by a stranger. She took his hand. Tell me everything, she said. Quick pause. What do you think Sophie should do next? Should she trust Maxim and take a chance, or is it time for her to walk away? Comment below with your thoughts. We want to know what you'd do in her shoes. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it to keep the adventure going. Your support means the world. The Imperial Ball was a dream made of crystal and candlelight, and the kind of wealth that could only exist when certain people weren't allowed to question where it came from. Sophie entered in her emerald gown, and nobody looked up. She'd prepared for this night for months. Not just the gown, though the emerald had been worth 3 months of her salary, a frivolous investment in the future she'd thought was coming. She'd prepared mentally, emotionally, strategically. She'd memorized the names and the histories and the alliances of every person who mattered in this room. She knew the Ashfords' connection to the Ministry of Trade. She knew Lady Whitmore controlled the social calendar for women of standing. She knew that Lord Ravencrest was the only voice in the old guard pushing for actual reform. She knew all of this because she'd researched it while James slept. She'd written position papers analyzing these exact people while James took the credit in morning meetings. She'd been the invisible architect of his understanding, while he'd been the visible face of imperial strategy. And tonight, finally, she was supposed to matter. The ballroom was arranged in concentric circles of power, the most important people clustered near the dais. The less important radiated outward. And Sophie had always existed in the spaces between, the gaps where servants and support staff moved without notice. Tonight, she was supposed to move inward, to take her place at James's side, to be introduced as his betrothed, to finally exist in the light instead of the shadows. The music was sublime. The food was incredible. And the energy in the room hummed with the particular electricity of a night where something momentous was about to happen. Sophie didn't know yet that the momentous thing was her own destruction. She moved through the crowd, accepting a champagne flute from a passing servant. The crystal was cool in her hands. The bubbles caught the light from the 1,000 candles suspended overhead in crystal chandeliers. She'd chosen her position carefully, near a marble column, far enough from the center of attention to observe, close enough to see everything when the moment came. The moment came at exactly 8 o'clock. Ladies and gentlemen, the Master of Ceremonies announced, "We present to you Lord James Crane of House Crane and his betrothed, Lady Heiress Bellamy of Bellamy Holdings." Sophie's heart stopped. She must have misheard. And the Master of Ceremonies had made a mistake. The announcement was premature. Something was wrong with what she'd just heard. James descended the grand staircase with a woman on his arm. Sophie watched it like she was watching it happen to someone else, like she was observing from very far away, like this was a story being told to her, not a moment happening in her actual life. The woman was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Perfect, polished, cold. She wore a gown that probably cost more than Sophie's entire wardrobe. Her tiara threw rainbows across the marble floor. When she smiled, it was the smile of someone who'd never needed anything she couldn't buy. James looked happy. That was the moment Sophie felt it, the moment her chest actually cracked. Not angry, not devastated, not even particularly sad. Just, empty. Like someone had reached in and removed the part of her that believed in things, that hoped for things, that thought she mattered. James looked happy. The court applauded. Sophie didn't move. She stood near her marble column, watching the man she'd built her life around descend the stairs with another woman, and she understood with absolute clarity that she'd been building on sand the entire time. Lord Ashford was already clapping James on the shoulder. "Well done, old friend. The Bellamy connection will do wonders for the family holdings." "Tremendous alliance," Lady Whitmore agreed, her fan fluttering. She looked at Heiress with the kind of approval she'd never directed at Sophie. "Lady Heiress is quite accomplished, I hear. Economics degree from the Royal Academy?" "With distinction," Heiress said smoothly. She was already comfortable holding court, already secure in her place, already everything Sophie had been working toward without ever being allowed to fully inhabit it. Sophie took a sip of champagne. It tasted like ash. "James always had excellent judgment," Heiress continued, and she said it like James was her possession now. Like his judgment had always been meant to serve her purposes. He understands the value of proper breeding and strategic alliance. Around her, Sophie heard people whispering. She caught fragments. That girl he was engaged to. What was he thinking? A commoner. Managed his correspondence, I believe. Any secretary can organize papers. The whispers weren't malicious. They were casual, dismissive. The kind of comments made about people who didn't matter. About situations that had never been important to begin with. Sophie had never felt less important in her entire life. She set down her champagne flute on a marble table. It was still half full, still glittering with bubbles. She looked at it for a moment, at the light refracting through the crystal, at the remnants of the life she'd thought was coming. And then she turned away from it, ready to leave this place. ready to leave this ballroom and this life and this empire if she had to. She didn't make it 3 steps. "Leaving so soon, Miss Grant." Sophie turned. The man from the study was standing behind her. She hadn't seen him come into the ballroom. She hadn't seen him cross the room. He'd simply appeared, like he'd been waiting for her to make this exact choice at this exact moment. Sophie started, then faltered, and she didn't have an explanation. She didn't have words. She didn't have anything except the overwhelming urge to not be in this room anymore. "You should stay," he said quietly. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it over the music and the crowd. Because something's about to happen. Something that's going to change everything. "What could possibly change?" Sophie began, but he was already pressing something into her hand. A white rose and a note, sealed with wax. "Open it when you're alone," he said, "and then decide if you're brave enough to do something about it." Before she could ask him anything, who he was, what he meant, how he knew her name, he'd melted back into the crowd. Sophie stood holding the rose and the note, feeling like the ground beneath her was made of water and she was slowly sinking. She unfolded the note right there, care thrown to the wind. "Don't spend the night crying in your room. Don't spiral into self-doubt. Don't convince yourself that his choice says anything about your worth. Instead, meet me in the royal gardens in 1 hour. There's something you need to see. Something that proves your value was never the question. His judgment was, come if you're ready to stop being invisible. Don't come if you'd rather believe his version of the story." Sophie looked up from the note. The man was standing on the far side of the ballroom, watching her. When their eyes met, he nodded once, a gesture so small that no one else would notice. Sophie looked at the white rose in her hand, at the note, at James, still descending the staircase with Heiress on his arm, still receiving congratulations from people who would have celebrated Sophie's value if they'd ever been allowed to see it. She had a choice. She could leave this ballroom and go home and cry and start over, building a new life from the ashes of the old one. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice, the choice a reasonable person would make. Or she could walk into the royal gardens and find out what a stranger was offering. Sophie Grant, who'd spent 3 years being invisible, made a choice. She walked toward the gardens. The royal gardens were a different world after dark. Sophie found them by following the paths she'd memorized from palace maps she'd once studied for James. Moonlight turned the marble fountains into something ethereal, something that didn't quite belong to the waking world. The water sounds were different too, softer, more contemplative, like the gardens themselves were thinking rather than displaying. She half expected Maxim not to be there, half expected to discover that the entire evening had been some elaborate dream, that she'd misheard the study conversation, that James would still be waiting for her with flowers and apologies and promises that meant nothing. But he was there. He stood by a stone archway overgrown with climbing vines, silhouetted against the moonlight. He didn't move when he saw her, didn't approach. He simply waited, watching her walk toward him like someone who'd already decided how this would unfold. "You came," he said. Not a question. An observation of a choice already made. Sophie stopped a few feet away from him, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how far from the palace, how completely this moment belonged to neither the world of the ball nor the world of her apartment. A place between, like the gardens themselves. "I almost didn't," she said. "I know." He turned to face her fully, and the moonlight caught his eyes. "But you did. And now you're here, and you need to understand something. What happened in James's study wasn't a personal betrayal. It was part of something larger, something that's been building for years. He explained it methodically, the way someone explains something they've spent a long time understanding. The Cranes' financial desperation, the Bellamy family's wealth built on trafficking networks and extortion, the treaties James had signed, treaties Sophie had written that would reshape trade routes in ways that would benefit criminal enterprises. And he was signing away thousands of lives, Maxim said quietly, and he didn't even know it. Sophie listened, but part of her was listening to something else. Some part of her was noting how much easier it was to breathe now that the betrayal wasn't just personal, now that it meant something beyond her own erasure. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because," Maxim said, "you're the only person who knows what he's actually capable of. And because I need to ask you something first." He stepped closer. "Who were you before James Crane existed? What did you want? What would you do if you knew no one would ever know about it?" Sophie opened her mouth, closed it. She realized, standing in that moonlit garden, that she didn't have an answer. She'd spent so long being useful to someone else that she'd forgotten how to be visible even to herself. "I don't know," she whispered. "Then help me expose them," Maxim said, "not for revenge, for justice. And in the process, maybe you'll figure out who Sophie Grant actually is." Sophie looked at this stranger offering her the impossible, and for the first time all evening, she felt something other than empty. She felt possibility. The next morning, Sophie went to work as though nothing had changed. She sat across from James in his study, the same study where she'd stood frozen behind the door 3 nights ago, and listened to him discuss trade negotiations with a visiting ambassador. She wrote notes in shorthand. She organized his thoughts into coherent arguments. She made him brilliant, as always, while she remained invisible. The only difference was that now she knew exactly what she was doing. Maxim had given her a folder before she left the gardens, not his entire collection of documentation. That would be too much, too dangerous, but enough. Enough to see the trafficking networks embedded in Bellamy Holdings' financial records. Enough to recognize her own handwriting on treaties James had signed, her analysis transformed into his diplomatic victories. Enough to understand that the corruption stretched far beyond one broken engagement. She spent 3 days in this strange limbo, moving between 2 worlds. By day, she was James's shadow, exactly as she'd always been. By night, alone in her apartment, she was drowning in documents. Trade agreements that didn't make sense economically unless you understood they were moving stolen goods. Supply chains that followed trafficking routes. Money trails that led back to families she recognized from court functions. The weight of it was suffocating. It wasn't like the weight she'd carried for 3 years. The invisible weight of her own erased labor, her unrecognized genius, her work existing under someone else's name. That weight had become familiar, almost comfortable in its invisibility. This was different. This was the weight of knowing things that could destroy people, of understanding that she now possessed information that, if revealed, would reshape the Empire's power structure. This was the weight of power itself. On the 3rd night, Maxim came to her apartment. She didn't ask how he knew where she lived. He simply appeared at her door with tea and a kind of quiet competence that suggested he'd been taking care of impossible situations for a very long time. He didn't ask her if she'd decided anything. He didn't push her toward action. He simply sat across from her at her small table and listened. She told him about the anger, watching James take credit year after year while she disappeared. She told him about the confusion, not knowing who she was supposed to be anymore, now that the future she'd been building toward had collapsed. She told him about the fear that even this, Even the chance Maxim had offered her might be taken away before she could understand what it meant. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finally stopped talking, when the silence stretched between them like something tangible, he reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not invisible anymore," he said quietly. "Not to me. And that's the beginning." Sophie realized, holding his hand in the lamplight of her small apartment, that being seen by one person was somehow enough to change everything. Maxim came to her apartment on the 7th day with a question that changed everything. "Marry me," he said. Not a request. A proposal stated as fact, like he'd already calculated the outcomes and was simply informing her of the results. Sophie stared at him. She'd been expecting many things. More documents, another late-night conversation, perhaps a timeline for the exposure. She hadn't been expecting this. "No," she said immediately. "Hear me out," Maxim replied, and there was something in his voice that suggested he'd anticipated her refusal. He sat across from her at the small table where they'd spent every evening that week, drinking tea and talking about corruption and identity and the weight of secrets. He explained it with the same methodical precision he used for everything. Marriage would elevate her socially, neutralizing the court's prejudice. It would give her access to resources and information she needed. It would align her with someone the nobility couldn't dismiss. And most importantly, it would prove, publicly and undeniably, that she didn't need James, that she'd never been dependent on his validation. "It's still transactional," Sophie said. "Yes," Maxim agreed, "but transactional doesn't have to mean empty." For hours they talked about what this would mean. He was honest about his intentions, exposing corruption in the empire, dismantling systems built on exploitation, honest about what he could offer: protection, resources, a partnership that might eventually become something real. Honest about what he couldn't promise: love, at least not immediately; safety, never completely; a happy ending, because there might not be one. Sophie asked the questions that mattered. Why her? Why not someone politically connected? Someone whose bloodline would strengthen his position? Why risk marrying a commoner when it would damage his standing? "Because you understand what it means to be underestimated," Maxim said quietly. "And because I believe you're brilliant enough to see what I'm trying to do, and brilliant enough to tell me when I'm wrong. I don't need someone who will follow me. I need someone who will challenge me." After he left, Sophie walked. She moved through the city without direction, past the lower districts where people were struggling under the weight of corrupt nobility. She walked to places James had never taken her, streets that existed in the margins of the empire. She walked until her feet hurt, and her mind was empty of everything except one clear thought. When she returned to her apartment, she wrote a letter. Not to Maxim, to herself, to the version of her that existed before James, to the version of her that might exist after this moment. The letter contained only one sentence: "I'm choosing myself, finally." The next morning, she found Maxim waiting in the palace gardens where they had first met. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it, folded it carefully, and placed it inside his coat, close to his heart. "Then let's begin," he said. Sophie nodded. She was terrified. She was hopeful. She was choosing a future she couldn't predict with a man she barely knew. But for the first time since the study door had swung open, she was choosing freely. And that changed everything. The chapel was small and hidden beneath the palace, accessible only through corridors that seemed to exist in the spaces between walls. No grand ballroom, No elaborate ceremony, just Sophie and Maxim and a priest with gray hair who asked no questions, as though clandestine weddings were a regular part of his vocation. The dress Maxim had purchased for her was beautiful in its simplicity, white lace without ostentation, elegant without spectacle. Sophie stood before a mirror and barely recognized herself, not because she looked different, but because for the first time, she was seeing herself through her own eyes instead of waiting for someone else to acknowledge her existence. When Maxim placed the ring on her finger, Sophie realized how much she still didn't know about him. She knew his name and his mission and why he'd chosen her. She knew he was military, that he was connected to the palace in ways that suggested power far beyond what he'd revealed. But she didn't know his favorite food, or what his childhood had been like, or why his eyes carried such deep sadness when he thought no one was looking. "I'm sorry I can't give you more," Maxim said quietly, standing close enough that only she could hear him. "I'm sorry this has to be secret. I'm sorry you deserve better than this." Sophie surprised herself by smiling. "I deserve agency. I deserve choice. I deserve someone who sees my value and doesn't ask me to dim my light to make him feel bigger. You're giving me all of that. The chapel doesn't matter. The spectacle doesn't matter." After the ceremony, they walked through the palace corridors late at night, when the halls belonged to shadows and silence. Maxim showed her passages she'd never known existed, hidden rooms and secret stairways that made the palace seem like a different structure entirely, one built in layers beneath the one everyone knew. "My role is larger than you understand," he said as they moved through darkness. "There are people I need to brief about our marriage. There are things you'll discover that will change how you see everything." "When?" Sophie asked. "Soon," he promised, "but not yet. Right now, I need you invisible to the court. I need you to use that invisibility one last time, because after we move, you'll never be invisible again." He brought her to a hidden study beneath the palace, a room that seemed to contain years of his life, compressed into files and documents and meticulous research. He gave her a key that felt impossibly heavy in her palm. "This is my life's work," Maxim said. "If anything happens to me, you need to understand what's in here. You need to be able to continue this." Sophie looked at the documents spread before her, at the scope of corruption documented so carefully, so completely. She understood then that she hadn't married a stranger for protection. She'd married him for purpose, and somehow that made everything real. 3 months disappeared like water through open fingers. To the court, nothing changed. Sophie still moved through the palace corridors like a ghost, invisible in the way that had become her native language. People still didn't know her name. Invitations to important gatherings still didn't arrive. James and Heiress still celebrated their alliance while the nobility watched with approval, as though destiny itself had aligned to reward their marriage. But everything had changed. Maxim positioned her as his personal assistant, a title that kept her invisible to the court, but gave her access to everything that mattered: diplomatic cables, intelligence reports, files that documented the architecture of corruption so thoroughly that Sophie began to see patterns others missed. She learned to predict which nobles would align with which criminals, how money moved through legitimate channels to fund illegitimate enterprises, and where the vulnerabilities in the system existed. More importantly, she learned Maxim. They had breakfast together every morning. He was terrible at cooking, all harsh flavors and burnt edges, but she'd started teaching him, and there was something intimate about standing beside him in the kitchen, guiding his hands, laughing at his failures. They had long conversations about his vision for the empire, not the specific corruption cases, but the broader dream of a system where merit mattered more than bloodline. She discovered that he'd been discharged from the military for investigating crimes his superiors didn't want exposed, that he'd spent 5 years building this case entirely alone, that he trusted her more completely than she'd ever been trusted by anyone. And somewhere between the breakfast table and the hidden study, one between conversations about corruption and conversations about nothing at all, something shifted between them. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it was real. One evening, reviewing documents in the pale lamplight, Maxim said something that made her set down her pen. "I didn't expect to actually like you. When I proposed this arrangement, I thought I was being practical. But I like you. I actually like talking to you and spending time with you." Sophie studied the man she'd married as a stranger. She realized she liked him too. Not despite the arrangement, but because of it. Because he'd never asked her to be less. Because he'd never made her feel small. "I like you too," she said. 2 weeks later, Maxim showed her the final piece. The evidence was gathered. The exposures were ready. The case against James and the Bellamys was airtight. At the Grand Imperial Ball, they would change everything. "After this," Maxim said quietly, "you won't be invisible anymore. The Empire will know who you are. Some will hate you for it. Are you ready?" Sophie thought about 3 years of erased work, about being dismissed and dismissed again. She thought about mattering, finally, to the people who needed to see her value. "I'm ready," she said, and this time, she meant it completely. The palace became a different organism in the days before the ball. Maxim moved through it like a man possessed, briefing the emperor, coordinating with reform-minded nobles, ensuring that guard units loyal to him were positioned exactly where they needed to be. Sophie watched him transform from the quiet man who made terrible breakfast into someone carved from steel and purpose. He barely slept. He barely spoke except in hushed conversations that happened behind closed doors. Sophie was being prepared for her own transformation, though in a different way. New clothes arrived, elegant gowns designed to announce her presence rather than conceal it. A stylist worked with her hair, teaching her how to wear visibility like a garment. Maxim brought her to stand before mirrors, and she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Not because she looked different, but because she finally looked like she belonged to herself instead of someone else. She was terrified. The courtwomen who knew her would remember her as James's invisible advisor, and they would see her emerge as the wife of someone mysterious and powerful, and they would whisper. They would question. They would search desperately for scandals to explain how someone from nothing had become someone. But the terrifying part wasn't their judgment. It was that they would finally see her. The night before the ball, Sophie asked to meet the emperor. Maxim arranged it with a single word to his father's aid. When she entered Constantine's private study, she understood where Maxim had learned to carry power like a second skin. The emperor was tall and severe, and his eyes assessed her with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people. "You understand what my son is about to do?" Constantine asked without preamble. "Yes, Your Majesty," Sophie replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "You understand it will shake the foundation of this empire?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "You understand that some of the people exposed will be powerful, and they will have allies, and there will be consequences?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Constantine studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "Good. He needs someone who understands the weight of what he's doing, someone who won't let him carry it alone. Later, Sophie and Maxim stood on the palace balcony, looking out at the capital spread below them. The lights of the city glittered like scattered diamonds. Somewhere beneath that beauty, corruption flourished. Somewhere in those streets, people suffered because the systems built to protect them had been weaponized instead. "Tomorrow," Maxim said quietly, "everything changes." Sophie took his hand. His palm was warm against hers, real and present and certain. "Tomorrow," she said, "I stop being invisible." She could feel the weight of those words settling between them, not heavy but solid, anchoring, like a promise made to herself that she finally had the courage to keep. Sophie entered the ballroom as Maxim's wife, and the entire room seemed to shift its axis. She wore deep crimson, a color that announced her rather than concealed her. She moved at his side, and people who'd never seen her before looked up. People who'd known her as James's invisible assistant stared like they were seeing a ghost made suddenly corporeal. She was visible. She was elegant. She was there. The master of ceremonies announced James and Heiress exactly as planned. Sophie watched them descend the grand staircase together. Their entrance choreographed and perfect. Heiress glowed with the certainty of someone who'd won. James looked exactly as he always had, soft, handsome, unremarkable. Sophie felt nothing. No anger, no regret, just a strange clarity, like watching someone from a great distance. The court applauded them into their moment. Then Maxim took the stage. He didn't announce his title immediately. Instead, he spoke about corruption, about systems built on exploitation, about brilliant people being erased while charlatans took credit. He spoke methodically, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. And as he spoke, he presented evidence. James's face went white. "Lord James Crane," Maxim said, holding documents up to the candlelight, "has claimed credit for 17 treaties authored by Sophie Grant, 12 trade agreements, 9 territorial negotiations, work that shaped empire policy, work that was never credited to the woman who conceived it." The whispers began immediately. Shocked, scandalized, delicious. "The Bellamy Holdings," Maxim continued, his voice cutting through the noise, "has built its fortune on human trafficking, extortion, and systematized theft. The wealth you see here is built on suffering." Heiress tried to stand. Guards moved subtly to prevent her from running. "I am Maxim Valentino, Crown Prince of the Eastern Empire," he announced, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "And this is the beginning of an investigation that will touch every corner of noble society. This is the beginning of systemic change." The court erupted, applause and gasps and the electric energy of a world being fundamentally altered. Sophie stood beside him, finally visible, finally acknowledged, finally mattering. But she didn't feel triumphant. She felt the weight of it. As she watched James's face crumble, not with anger, but with the desperate confusion of someone who had never understood the value of what he was destroying, she felt sadness. She'd just helped destroy someone, even if he deserved it. After the revelations, James approached her. He looked diminished somehow, all his soft edges now appearing pathetic. He tried to apologize, to explain, to convince her that it had never meant to be this way. Sophie looked at him with compassion and then complete indifference. "I forgive you," she said quietly. "Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger at you is exhausting. I'm moving on." She turned away from him then, and she understood that forgiveness wasn't absolution. It was release. It was choosing herself over the weight of his regrets. It was finally, completely done. Sophie woke to find herself famous. The morning newspapers had already printed her name, not as an assistant, not as an afterthought, but as the woman at the center of the empire's greatest scandal. Journalists called her a victim. Others called her a social climber who'd engineered her spectacular rise. The more dangerous voices called her powerful, and there was something in that word that made her understand she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer safe. Emperor Constantine summoned her to his study to discuss her official position in government. It was a role created specifically for her, Imperial Advisor on Diplomatic Affairs. It was unprecedented. It was terrifying. It meant accepting authority from people who'd spent their lives underestimating her, and they would resent her for every decision she made. But the weight of what she'd done was far heavier than her own discomfort. In the lower districts, families lost their livelihoods when Bellamy Holdings was dissolved. The investigation into noble corruption meant servants were dismissed, economies collapsed, people who had nothing lost even that. Sophie saw reports crossing her desk, unemployment surging, food shortages in certain neighborhoods, families destroyed by the asset seizures. Justice, she realized, had a cost, and the people who paid it were rarely the ones who deserved to. She found Maxim in his study late that evening, reviewing more evidence for the ongoing investigations. "How many families will be destroyed?" she asked quietly. Maxim didn't look up from his papers. "Hundreds, probably. Thousands indirectly." "And you're prepared to accept that?" "Yes," he said simply, "because the alternative is letting the corruption continue to poison everything it touches." Sophie sat across from him. "That's not a choice I made." "No," Maxim agreed, finally looking at her. "It's a choice I made, and you're bearing the weight of it. That's not fair." "Nothing about this is fair," Sophie replied, "but we can't unmake what we've created." There was a long silence between them. It wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. They both understood that power meant accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond their intentions, that justice wasn't clean, that doing the right thing created wounds that would take years to heal. "I didn't marry you for this," Sophie said finally. "I know," Maxim replied, "but I married you because I knew you could handle it, because you could look at the destruction we've caused and not look away from it." Sophie understood then that their marriage had transformed in that single moment, from strategic arrangement to genuine partnership. They were building something together now, something that would require both of them to carry the moral weight of power. She reached across the desk and took his hand. His grip was steady, certain, real. "Then we'll carry it together," she said. And in the darkness of that study, surrounded by the evidence of corruption they'd exposed, they began the harder work of learning to live with what they'd become. 6 months after the ball, Sophie received an official commission from Emperor Constantine, Imperial Advisor on Diplomatic Affairs, not assistant, not shadow, not anyone's possession. A role created specifically to recognize who she was and what she knew. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer defined by proximity to anyone else's power. She was defining herself. The real victory she'd come to understand wasn't exposing James or marrying Maxim, or the title now attached to her name. The real victory was discovering who Sophie Grant actually was, underneath all the invisibility. A woman who could think 3 moves ahead. A woman who understood systems. A woman who possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from knowing her own value. That evening, she and Maxim stood on the palace balcony, the same place where they had stood the night before the ball. The city spread below them looked different now. Not transformed exactly, but slowly healing from the wounds of exposure and reform. "I didn't expect this," Sophie said, looking at him. "I didn't expect to actually fall in love with you." Maxim turned to face her. "I didn't expect it either, but I'm glad I did." They spoke about the future then, about the empire they wanted to build together, about whether their marriage, which had begun as strategic necessity, had become something worth keeping. The answer came easily, yes, not because they'd stumbled into romance, but because they'd built genuine partnership, because they challenged each other, because they could sit in difficult silence and emerge stronger. In the weeks that followed, Sophie began mentoring younger women in the palace, girls who reminded her of herself, intelligent, ambitious, invisible to the people around them. She taught them how to write position papers that couldn't be ignored, how to present ideas with such clarity that no one could claim them as their own. She was breaking the system that had tried to erase her by refusing to let it erase anyone else. James came to see her one afternoon. He was thinner now, weathered by months of public service. He brought flowers and apologies and the desperate hope that she might forgive him in some larger, redemptive way. Sophie listened kindly. She accepted his flowers, but she didn't accept his narrative of regret and redemption. "I'm glad you're doing the work," she told him, "but I'm not the person you need to apologize to." I moved on. He left looking stricken, and Sophie felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction. Just the clear understanding that his journey wasn't her responsibility. From her office window, Sophie looked out over the empire. She'd traded invisibility for visibility, safety for responsibility. Invisibility had offered freedom. The freedom to observe, to plan, to exist without judgment. But visibility offered something deeper, the chance to change systems rather than just survive within them. She'd chosen the responsibility. She'd chosen herself. And from the wreckage of everything that had broken, she was building something real. Thank you so much for watching. What did you think of Sophie and Maxim's story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it to support the channel. I can't wait to bring you more stories soon. See you next time.